Okay, and that brings us to the last of the books that I'm going to review here a little bit. It's a new translation, The Dead Sea Scrolls by um, Michael Wise, Martin Abegg Jr., and Edward Cook. I don't have this in PDF, so I'm going to have to do some reading, and I'm just sorry. So I'm going to do, but I'm just going to tell you as I look at it. I'm going to do what I did in the others, and this is just kind of give you an idea of the way the forward and introductions are laid out. So we have the first thing they start out with is their contents, where they lay out the various scrolls that they translated. And then they move into a preface where they explain themselves. I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to go read through that. Then a preface to the revised edition and why they did it. Then they get into the prolegomena. I'm not even sure what that means. But then they move into introduction and they begin to share things like the discovery and publications, what the other ones did too. You know, talking about how the caves were discovered and what it meant, how the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. They give their idea how they were written on papyrus and different things. The languages used in the scrolls, they analyze that for you. The scripts used for writing the scrolls, and they spend more time on the scripts than the others do. And that is, I'm not a linguist. I don't, or whatever you would call it. I'm not a specialist in anything like this, but this is where they're talking about the Paleo Hebrew and the three different types of cryptic scripts. So basically, it's how they write, the method that they write, and interesting, but not what we're after. Then they've got contents, as noted. The scrolls are Jewish religious texts. They go on to talk about the contents. Then they have the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here they say it's not true, and I'll just read this a little bit to you here. It's not true that within a month after the discovery of the scrolls, everyone thought Essenes wrote them, although in retrospect, it may seem that way. The Essenes were one of the major groups among the Jews at the turn of the era. It is true that the initial press released in April 1948 mentioned them, and both popular and academic studies of the first scrolls argued for Essene authorship. As the studies piled up, though, the Essene hypothesis did not have the field to itself. So challenges to, again, the similarities and then the differences. And so challenges to the Essene theory arose. Then they've got some more information about it. And then they introduce what's called the standard model. And I'm pretty much going to have to read an awful lot of that for you. And the standard model is their terminology for what I believe Gisa and some of them were just talking about as mainstream hypothesis. And this is their take, their version of the hypothesis that has the theories that have dominated. Give me a second before, let me just organize just a bit. I was saying, okay, so I just quickly reviewed this and let me just show you. So here I've got the standard model and it goes 1, 2, 3, goes to into this page. I reviewed it, and there's enough in here that I would need to read that if I didn't just read the whole thing to you, it would be all cut up. So if you would just indulge me, and this is really this is it for this book. So if I can get through this, then that will finish up this particular part in section. So let me just read their standard model to you. The Essene hypothesis is one leg of an influential three-legged theory about the Qumran text that we shall call the standard model. There are two other legs to it, which will here be called the anti-Hasmonean hypothesis and the mother house hypothesis. The anti-Hasmonean hypothesis has to do with the historical origins of the Essene movement. The mother house hypothesis concerns the connection of the scrolls to the Khirbet Qumran ruins located near some of the caves. It will be convenient to consider each of the three legs in turn, starting with what we know about the Essenes. Josephus goes into some detail about the beliefs and customs of the Essenes, but he says, and probably knew, nothing about their origin or how they came to have their beliefs. The scrolls, if they are of Essene origin, tell us more, although in veiled terms, the Damascus document and the commentaries, particularly the commentary on Habakkuk, mention some of the prominent people and events involved in the founding of the group. which I just don't. I won't stop. Ordinarily, such information would be of tremendous historical value. In the scrolls, however, there's a catch. Most of the dramatis personae are named only under symbolic pseudonyms. So basically, most of the persons of interest are named only under symbolic pseudonyms. Thus, the apparent founder of the group is called only the teacher of righteousness. The prominent member of the group or groups opposing him is called the man of the lie, or sometimes the spewer of lies, who may be the leader of a sinister cabal called the flattery seekers, and the sect's chief persecutor is designated only as the wicked priest. There is another ruler called the Lion of Wrath, and there is a menacing foreign power known as the Kittim. A story can be pieced together from the various texts. The teacher of righteousness was a priest exceptionally gifted in religious insight. Indeed, he had been granted special revelations from God about the true meaning of Scripture and the proper interpretation of the law of Moses. Although he succeeded in gaining a following among other priests and righteous Jews, he was opposed by the man of the lie, who, by his cunning rhetoric, was able to dissuade many from submitting to the teacher's precepts. The flattery seekers also opposed the ministry of the teacher. The wicked priest, however, initially seemed to be favorable to the teacher, but when he ruled in Israel, he showed himself to be irreligious, greedy, corrupt, and violent. He harried the teacher and his followers, drove them into exile, and on at least one occasion made an attempt to have the teacher killed, apparently without success. The wicked priest was threatened by Gentile powers and was captured and mistreated by them. There is no certain indication that the teacher died a violent death, although that is possible. The text often combine elements of this story of the teacher with imprecations on his and the group's enemies. In particular, the imminent coming of the rapacious Kittim is understood to be divine punishment on the nation for its rejection of the teacher of righteousness and his followers. So let me stop there because I need to make comment. Here they are once again identifying the teacher of righteousness as the prominent member of the group that founded the society, with the man of lies being those who have set themselves up in resistance to it. There's so much in what I just read that fits the information I provided in previous sections that fits how, just like for instance, let me see if I can follow it. Initially, first of all, they set themselves up. The illegitimate priesthood set themselves up against the Messiah, who they say, thus the apparent founder. Okay, so they do it. Here's where they say that the apparent founder of the group is called the teacher of righteousness, the prominent member opposing the man of lies. And then in the story, they say that this teacher of righteousness was a priest exceptionally gifted in religious insight. Of course, Messiah was. Indeed, he had been granted special revelations from Elohim about the true meaning of Scripture and the proper interpretation of the law of Moses. Of course, that's what the teacher of righteousness, the Messiah, is all about. They're just missing it. It's the Messiah. It's not the founder of the community. It's no one person that is this teacher of righteousness. And then, they talk about how although he succeeded in gaining a following among the priests and other righteous Jews, he was opposed by the man of lie, who, by his cunning rhetoric, was able to dissuade many from submitting to the teacher's precepts. Is that not so true? The faithful remnant, the faithful priests follow the teacher of righteousness into the ways of Torah, into the ways of righteousness, into Elohim's ways. But the wicked priests, the illegitimate priests who have reasons to oppose that because they are now sitting in positions of power, dissuade the masses, dissuade the majority of all Israel to reject the teacher of righteousness, which is exactly what happened. Only the faithful remnant received Messiah, and the masses, under the leadership of the wicked priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, everything during those times that was prevalent Judaism, rejected the teacher and his ways. And the wicked priest initially seemed to be favorable to the teacher, but when he ruled in Israel, so ideally, that could almost describe what I was saying about the Maccabees. So Judas Maccabees, they set up and they're fighting against the Greeks for Torah, for the ways of Yahweh. That's how they start out, and they start. Uh, and Judas Maccabees leads it, and then Jonathan, when he's killed, Jonathan, his brother, steps up into it as well. But at some point, as the war has moved on, the Greek leader appeals to Jonathan by offering him the high priesthood and knew that Jonathan could not resist, and he was right. That's at least according to the other book that we were reading. And so with that, now we have the Maccabees succumbing to temptation. And so they were initially following the teacher of righteousness and his ways, and part of pursuing Yahweh and his Torah and his ways. Now, Jonathan immediately takes the high priesthood and should not have. I think that's succumbing to temptation and should not have taken it. That doesn't mean he was immediately wicked. He could have still been trying to follow Torah and just missing out on that. We have plenty of examples of people who cared about Torah who failed in certain points, like David. Doesn't matter, name them. Where they failed in certain points. Simon probably also, one of the brothers probably also pretty decent. I don't know that they were wicked in nature, but he stepped in and continued it. With Hyrcanus, though, definitely. Now you have a definite affront against the teachers of righteousness. And as the Pharisees grew in prominence and different things in the city, they all ended up becoming part of this whole mainstream setup, this whole mainstream society. So it makes sense how when it reads, the wicked priest, however, initially seemed to be favorable to the teacher, but when he ruled in Israel, which is the wicked priesthood, all of them, and maybe it's, just sitting here reading this, when he ruled in Israel, that sounds like when the kingship was added or the governorship. Under Jonathan, he was given governorship. So he ruled in a way as governor. When Simon came on, he actually ruled. He became pontificus, or whatever you would call it, the king. He became king and priest. So he ruled. So maybe this all starts with the ruling. Maybe this all starts under Simon because when he ruled in Israel, he showed himself to be irreligious, greedy, corrupt, and violent. Whether Simon proved himself to be greedy, corrupt, what else did it say? Irreligious, greedy, corrupt, and violent. Whether Simon actually proved himself out to be that or not, certainly his successor, which was Hyrcanus, Jonathan Hyrcanus, I believe, Hyrcanus followed, and he proved to be all those things, as did everyone that followed after that. And the wicked priest was threatened by Gentile powers and was captured and mistreated by them. There were times Jonathan, Tryphon, arrested him, and so that's Jonathan, arrested Jonathan. And then we have times where Rome comes into the scene. So maybe. Okay. So all of that reading in this standard model that they just offered could fit their narrative, but it can also fit the narrative that I've offered. And I think it does fit the narrative I've offered. There's nothing they're offering, even though they're offering it in terms of their narrative. When you apply the same history, the way it played out to my narrative, it also fits, and I think in a better way against the entire story from beginning of the old writings straight on through the new writings on up into the end of times. Okay, so let me continue. So scholars have ransacked the turbulent history of Israel in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE to find scenarios that match the synopsis above. Very briefly, that history goes like this. After the Jews had thrown off the yoke of the Greek kings of Syria in 165 BCE. So after the Maccabean revolt, they're saying that they threw off the yoke of the Greek kings of Syria in 165 BC through the Maccabees. They were ruled by the priestly family of the Hasmoneans, also known as the Maccabees, leaders of the revolt. For slightly less than a century, from 152 BCE to 63 BCE, Judea was independent under Hasmonean rule and even expanded its territory to something like boundaries under David and Solomon. So I would say that's true, that they were independent under Hasmonean rule. They did have a degree of independence there, but they still Off to the north and east were the Seleucids, to the south were the Ptolemies, and to the west were Rome. And ultimately, Rome came in and just took over the province. So basically, while they were independent, they were only independent to the extent that Greece quit harassing them, the Seleucids quit harassing them, the Ptolemies quit harassing them, and Rome, who ultimately comes in and harasses them, but they weren't harassing them at this point in time. That's the only reason there was independent rule under the Hasmonean priest kings or the Maccabees. All right. So Judea was independent under Hasmonean rule and even expanded its territory to something like boundaries under David and Solomon. At the same time, however, the country was riven by religio-political factions, of which the two main ones were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The origins of both groups are obscure. Josephus first mentions them as existing Josephus first mentions them as existing with the Essenes during the reign of the early Hasmonean high priest Jonathan Maccabee in 152 to 142 BCE. So basically, Josephus basically refers to them as coming to be under Jonathan Maccabee, the first Hasmonean king's reign in 152 BCE. It is certain that the Pharisees, largely a lay movement, and the liberals of their day generally opposed the Hasmoneans. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were composed primarily of priests and, as the conservatives, supported the Hasmoneans. So, and we'll see that the Pharisees pushed back and ended up paying because many of them got slaughtered by the Hasmonean priests. But the Sadducees, elsewhere I've seen that the Sadducees were sitting in the high priesthood. So the high priesthood pretty much was composed of Sadducees. Now, we know that the high priesthood in this time were the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans. So were the Hasmoneans the founders of the Sadducees and the Sadducean movement in the days of Yahushua, turn of the, you know, in the end of this era and the beginning of the new era, the Sadducees were sitting, to my understanding, were sitting in the priestly roles, while the Pharisees were largely sitting in the influential roles, prominence in the society. Okay, so I'm just going to read that again. It's certain, I'm just going to read all of that again. The origins of both groups are obscure. Josephus first mentions them as existing with the Essenes during the reign of the early Hasmonean high priest Jonathan Maccabee in 152 to 142 BCE, and it's certain that the Pharisees, largely a lay movement, and the liberals of their day generally opposed the Hasmoneans. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were composed primarily of priests, and as the conservatives, supported the Hasmoneans. The Pharisees were distinguished in particular for their oral law, an unwritten adjunct to the scriptures that claimed to provide the correct interpretation of Holy Writ. That's why they get chastised by John the Baptist and Yahushua and Paul, because they've added to the oral law and say that their oral laws are interpreting the Torah and superimposed. They're greater than the law of the Torah. Anathema. It's just wrong. As Josephus wrote, the Pharisees have imposed on the people many laws from the tradition of the fathers, not written in the law of Moses. We'll read that again. According to Josephus, the Pharisees have imposed on the people many laws from the traditions of the fathers, not written in the law of Moses. These traditions of the fathers were the genius of the movement, for they spelled flexibility, enabling the Pharisees to adjust to new situations and to recast old laws as new circumstances required. Naturally, to the Sadducees and other non-Pharisaic groups among the Jews, these same traditions were anathema. The Pharisees were nevertheless often able to impose their will because they were the group that enjoyed the most support among the general populace. They were the forebears of the rabbis, and rabbinic literature contained, they were the forebears of the rabbis, and rabbinic literature contains a fair number of laws and traditions that go back to the Pharisees. So rabbis, rabbinic law, that's Pharisees. The Pharisees were also the group most often depicted in the Gospels as opposing Jesus and his interpretations of the law. The teacher of righteousness, interpretations of the law, correct interpretations of the law. You'll see when I get to this, I'm going to do a study on the teacher of righteousness and how the teacher of righteousness is to be the correct interpreter of the law. Our strongest arguments are often within our own family. Josephus further tells us that the Pharisees believed in resurrection and the existence of angels and spirits, whereas according to the New Testament, their principal competitors for power, the Sadducees, denied both. Whether the Sadducees actually did deny these doctrines, pure and simple, especially the existence of angels, is problematic. Angels appear in the books of Moses, after all, and every Jew embraced those writings. As a priestly party, the Sadducees may, however, have questioned the resurrection, since the ancient priestly doctrine of the afterlife, as found in the Hebrew Bible and the apocryphal book of Sirach, for example, held that a shadowy existence in Sheol follows death. This ill-defined existence was much less desirable than earthly life. For the ancient priests, true life after death consisted primarily in the continuation of one's name through children and grandchildren, and leaving behind a blessed memory. In any case, what is certain is that the Sadducees, whose primary support lay with the Jerusalem elite, denied the Pharisaic understanding of these matters. That denial was part conviction, part political necessity. During the tenure of Alexander Jannaeus, from in 103 BCE to 76 BCE, the Pharisees helped invite the Greek king of Syria, Demetrius III, to mount a military campaign against Alexander. So the Pharisees helped Greek mount a military campaign against one of the Hasmonean priests, Alexander Jannaeus, for which they were severely punished when the revolt failed. Alexander later received very bad press from Josephus, who depicted him as a drunken, war-besotten monarch whose greatest pleasure, outside of drink and war, was consorting publicly with his many concubines. But as we shall see, not everyone among the Jews would have accepted Josephus's characterization, and the other side finds a voice among the scrolls. Alexander and the Pharisees were for 6 years on opposite sides of a civil war among the Jews. And it was in this context that, desperate to remove Alexander, the Pharisees turned to the traditional Syrian Greek enemies of the Jews for help. Later, after Alexander's death, his widow, Salome Alexandra, came under Pharisaic influence and allowed them to suppress dissenting views. She was thus the antithesis of her husband. Whereas he had embraced and been embraced by the Sadducees and other priestly groups, she allied herself with the Pharisees. The reason for the switch was purely political. Knowing that she could not hope to appeal to both Sadducees and Pharisees, Salome, depicted by Josephus as a prudent and energetic queen, if a bit naive, simply calculated which group support would most strengthen her own position. After Salome's death in 67 BCE, yet another civil war broke out between her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, partisans of the Pharisees and Sadducees, respectively. So Hyrcanus was a partisan of the Pharisees and Aristobulus a partisan of the Sadducees. Thus, the military disputes between the principal religious factions among the Jews continued for yet another generation. Hyrcanus had already been a high priest while his mother reigned. Upon her death, he simply assumed the royal mantle as well. But Hyrcanus was weak and had no real stomach for war or the other duties that monarchs of that period were expected to perform. At least that's the way Josephus tells us. He abdicated the throne in favor of his much more ambitious brother Aristobulus, but later, at the instigation of members of the Jerusalem elite, had second thoughts. War broke out between the brothers, and the war ended only when the Romans invaded and added Judea to the list of Roman provinces in 63 BCE. Qumran pseudonyms can be correlated with Judean history in two cases, the Kittim and the wicked priests. The Kittim, conquerors of nations, are pretty clearly the Romans, and the wicked priest, who was a ruler of Israel, must have been one of the Hasmoneans. But which one? Rather than focus on the period from Alexander Jannaeus to the coming of the Romans, most proponents of the Standard Model look to an earlier time and favor early members of the family, either Jonathan Maccabee or his brother and successor Simon from 142 to 134 BC. Why? So they're saying that the wicked priest, who was also a ruler of Israel, must have been one of the Hasmoneans, but which one? So they're saying, rather than focus on the period from Alexander to the coming Romans, most proponents of the Standard Model look to either Jonathan or Simon to be that first wicked priest. Okay, so the Groningen hypothesis, and I embrace that it maybe starts with Jonathan, but it runs through Simon all the way down through Alexander Jannaeus, on down through Aristotle, all the way down, all the way down. The conclusion then, okay, one main reason is archaeological, and that leads us to the mother house hypothesis. The Standard Model stipulates that the Khirbet Qumran site, see below on the archaeology of the Khirbet Qumran, was the central headquarters of the Essene movement. No. And the main dwelling place of the teacher and his disciples. No, I think that the sons of Zadok would have lived there, and the priests would have lived there, and some of the faithful would have lived there, but they also would have lived out and about. But the teacher of righteousness would have been, in my estimation, the Messiah, and the teacher of righteousness wasn't living there. The teacher of righteousness came later. All right. Main dwelling place of the teacher and his disciples after their rejection by the establishment. Proponents then proceed to read out a chronological framework for Essene history from the settlement history of the ruin. Since the site's history has been understood to begin around the middle of the 2nd century BCE, again, the wicked priest must have been the Hasmonean then holding office, either Jonathan or Simon. That conclusion is then further buttressed by a certain reading of the Damascus document, which reads like this. Now they're going to include the Damascus portions of the Damascus document. It reads like this in their translation. When in their treachery Israel abandoned him, he turned away from Israel and from his sanctuary and gave them up to the sword. But when he remembered the covenant of the forefathers, he left a remnant to Israel and did not allow them to be totally destroyed. But in a time of wrath, 390 years, when he put them to the power of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he took care of them and caused to grow from Israel and from Aaron a root of planting to inherit his land and to grow fat on the good produce of his soil. They considered their iniquity, and they knew that they were guilty men, and had been like the blind and like those groping for the way 20 years. But Elohim considered their deeds, that they had sought him with a whole heart, so he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. The Standard Model understands this passage to be, in a nutshell, the history of the founding of the sect. The ambiguous statement about 390 years is interpreted so that the 390 years follow rather than precede, as is possible in the original Hebrew, the conquest of Nebuchadnezzar, which happened in 586 BC. Subtractions yield the date 196, and an additional 20 year leads to 176 as the beginning of the teacher's ministry. Since his activity could have lasted some 30 years, the teacher and Jonathan Maccabee could easily have been contemporaries. So having read the Damascus document, I argue that the reading is better in the other two translations and best in the one that I pointed out. I don't particularly like this one, but you can still, when I do the teacher of righteousness, I'll focus on this a little more, but you can still see that their assertion that the Damascus document says that the teacher of righteousness was the founder of the community, I just think it's wrong. Because after it says, after it reads the 390 from the days of Nebuchadnezzar, then they understood that they were guilty men and then grumbled about for 20 years. So they act like that is a timeline, and that could be a timeline. But then it says, but God considered their deeds and that they had sought him with a whole heart. And so he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness. So they're assuming that raising up the teacher of righteousness is the raising up of the founder of this Qumran sect rather than the Messiah. I think it's pretty clearly, if you follow the old writings, that when he raises up the teacher of righteousness, He's talking about the Messiah just as he was, just as he was in the prophet Joel. So I just think these folks don't know enough about their scriptures when they're making these assessments, in my opinion. And you know, I would say that it is true that Jonathan Maccabee and the Qumran community and the sons of Zadok who might have been leading it and the priest who might have been leading it were all contemporary. So Jonathan Maccabee, the Hasmonean dynasty, would have been contemporary with the founding of the community led by the sons of Zadok and the priests. But what made Jonathan so wicked? There is no indication in Josephus or other sources that he was notably corrupt or violent. Here the model baldly asserts that Jonathan's great sin was precisely in accepting appointment as high priest of Israel under the auspices of the Syrian Greek king Alexander Belus in 152 BC. The Hasmonean family, although of priestly stock, did not belong to the descendants of David's high priest Zadok, from whom alone many Jews thought the high priest could come. Of course, if this act was what made Jonathan wicked, then his successors to the high priestly throne, in short, all of the Hasmoneans, must likewise have been odious to the Essenes. Well, okay, so there's so much truth in that, and yet missing so much. It says that I want to comment first that the Hasmonean family, although of priestly stock, did not belong to the descendants of David's high priest Zadok, from whom alone many Jews thought the high priest could come. Well, no, Torah makes that. It's firm and sound and clear in Torah. A son of Aaron sits in the high priesthood. Zadok was the last, and his line was the last of the sons of Aaron. So only the sons of Zadok could sit in the throne, in the high priesthood. So when a Hasmonean, a Levite but not a Zadok, steps in willingly into that role, they're violating Torah. And that is odious to anybody who's faithful to Torah, the faithful remnant. And this affirms what I was saying earlier, that maybe Jonathan didn't, he was clearly part of leading the revolt against the Greeks and fighting for Torah. I don't know that his actions were wicked in that he was a wicked guy, and maybe not even Simon, but the very act that he took on himself the high priest role when he should have given it back to a son of Zadok would be wicked enough. And that's what they're asserting here. And likewise, if you don't want to identify Jonathan as the wicked priest or Simon as the wicked priest, you really have, as the Groningen hypothesis says, all of the priests that sit illegitimately are wicked priests. So altogether, cumulatively, they are the wicked priest, from Jason, and if not Jason, certainly Melanias, the first Hellenist, second Hellenist priest, all the way down to the last of them, maybe even all the way through 70 AD. They would all be considered wicked priests because they were all sitting illegitimately in the priesthood. Okay. In turn, so the theory goes, their opposition to Hasmonean rule made the Essenes. Okay, let me before I even go on. In short, in the previous paragraph and where I had ended, in short, the Hasmoneans must likely have been odious to the Essenes. They're saying that because they've embraced the Essenes as the occupants of this community. I'm saying it's not odious to the Essenes. We don't know enough about the Essenes. Outside of Josephus and Pliny and the other one, what we know about the Essenes and think we know about the Essenes come from these scrolls. We think we are understanding the scrolls because we're applying the characteristics of the community to the Essenes. But in truth, it's not the Essenes. I don't think it can possibly be the Essenes. It's the faithful remnant. It is what the priesthood would have looked like. It is what the faithful remnant of Israel looked like. So it's not odious to the Essenes. It's odious to the faithful remnants. It's odious to the sons of Zadok. It's odious to the Levitical priests who are fighting for Torah and righteous ways. That's who it's odious to, not the Essenes. In turn, so the theory goes, their opposition to Hasmonean rule made the Essenes obnoxious to the government and to some other Jews, and they were hounded by Jonathan or his successor Simon into exile in the Judean desert, where they built a settlement. There they remained for at least 2 centuries. isolated and insulated from the evil regime of the Hasmoneans, from the Roman successors to the Hasmoneans, and from the corrupt society of Judea, which had rejected the holy verities of the teacher of righteousness. Again, there's so much truth packed into there, but applied incorrectly. Because let's just read this again. In turn, so the theory goes, their opposition to Hasmonean rule didn't make the Essenes obnoxious. It made the faithful remnant obnoxious, just as it always did, the faithful remnant of the sons of Zadok and the priests and the people, not the Essenes. And as was taught, and in the days of Yahushua, that community, John the Baptist, think of John the Baptist as part of that community. And when he was faced with the Pharisees, how did he reply to the Pharisees? Who told you to flee from the wrath to come? Clearly, there was animosity between John and his people and the Pharisees and their people. That would be like John of the community and the Pharisees of the larger society, who had the power of the temple and the power of society and the power of the populace behind them. John had the community and Yahuwah and Torah and right understanding, righteousness, the witnesses, the testimonies on his side, along with Yahushua when he comes, because it's to John and his community that Yahushua comes, and not to the Pharisees and their community and larger society out of the temple. Okay, and they were hounded by Jonathan. Well, I don't know that Jonathan is the one that hounded them, or even Simon was the one that hounded him, but it seems realistic. Hounded them into exile in the Judean desert, where they built the settlement and they remained for 2 centuries. We do know that it was about 2 centuries long, that it all lasted 200 years. That's a long time. But we don't know that it was Jonathan or Simon that hounded them into that. Maybe. I really think it was probably more the Hellenistic priests that did the hounding, like Milanius. As Judaism was outlawed, all things Israel outlawed in the days of Menelaus, they were probably the ones that hounded, and they probably were at least, that probably lends to the idea that the Hellenist priests were also part of that grouping of the wicked priests, and they were probably the ones that hounded them out there to that community. I have a hard time believing that Jonathan and Simon would have hounded. Hyrcanus, yes. And the rest of them, because now they, and maybe Simon once he took on the role of king as well. But Hyrcanus and the rest of them, they were power hungry. They were everything we just heard described. That was them. And I think I read in the Giza Vermes book where they have a little more information about the successors to Simon and what they were like. And maybe it's in this book, but I've read somewhere they weren't good people. But clearly there's this idea that they were hounded into the desert. Okay. During the Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 to 73 CE, which is AD, they fell afoul of the Roman legions and their settlement was destroyed, but not before they were able to conceal a precious library in the nearby caves. Such, in brief, is the understanding of the historical background of the Dead Sea sect that many scholars hold today. It would be pointless to deny the element of truth in the standard model, but it is also fair to say that it has had much too easy of a time in scholarly circles. There are significant gaps in this theory, and some of the new texts have the effect of spotlighting these gaps. Also, there are many weaknesses in the notion that the ruin was once the headquarters of the Essenes. There are many weaknesses in the notion that the ruin was once headquartered in the Essenes. So clearly, they're sharing that there are some problems and some gaps in that standard model. But if they would apply some of what I'm saying, they would find less gaps. To identify them with the Essenes does add to the idea. It leaves it lacking, and you know that you don't have a satisfactory explanation. If you understand it to be the faithful remnant of Israel, it takes on a more satisfactory explanation. Okay, so the next section, they have one. That was the end of the standard model. Then they have a section called the site of Kerbet Qumran, which I'm not going to read or go through. Then they have further problems with the standard model. Not only is the connection of the ruin to the scrolls unsure, but the Essene hypothesis leg of the standard model itself is vulnerable to criticisms of one kind and another. Okay. As noted, the parallels between some of the scrolls, especially the Charter and that's what they call the Community Rule, and Josephus's description of the Essenes are striking, but the scrolls give no evidence of other notable characteristics of the Essenes. For instance, Josephus and Pliny and the Jewish philosopher Philo all describe the Essenes as celibate. Indeed, it is perhaps their most arresting trait. But the scrolls contain no command to be celibate, and on the contrary, numerous passages presuppose the opposite, that the group members will be married. Yep, you can read that. Philo also says the Essenes pursued only peaceful occupations, and yet the war scroll gives detailed prescriptions for the conduct of a very real, though future, armed conflict against the powers of darkness. Yes, let me into that. Philo and Josephus also agree that the Essenes rejected slavery, and yet the Damascus document has rules governing the treatment of slaves, as did all the old writings and the Torah. Another writing called the Ordinances, that's what they call it, further regulates slavery. Josephus mentions, among other things, the white garments of the Essenes, of which the scrolls say nothing. If the classical sources describe the Essenes in ways that conflict or lack support from the contents of the scrolls, the opposite is also the case. The scrolls stress beliefs that Josephus and Philo say nothing about. The doctrine that Elohim had commanded Israel to follow a 364-day solar calendar instead of the 354-day lunar calendar was a key tenet of the Qumran group. This peculiar calendar unifies the scrolls more than any other single sectarian element. Yet Josephus and Philo say nothing of the calendar. The scrolls strongly emphasize the role of priests and the group of leadership, but again, Josephus says not a word about priestly dominance, although he himself came from a priestly family and claims to have studied with the Essenes as a youth. Josephus also fails to mention the teacher of righteousness in his extensive description of the Essenes. So I want to comment to the calendar because it's clear in the scrolls we have the 364-day Enoch calendar. That is the basis from which they ordered their rotations and the Moedim, the festival, the appointed times of Yahuwah. And that stands in contrast to the 354-day lunar-based calendar that is passed down to us through, if you go into the traditions of the Jews, but that's the Babylonian-based Greek calendar that became popular under the Hellenistic Jews and then the Hasmonean Jews because they kept on embracing it right on up into the days of Yahushua, the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah the first time, and that's how we have conflicting days and we get different times. We see the day of preparation listed twice when we're talking about the crucifixion week. Okay, and finally there's a section called A New Proposal for Scroll Origins. So we saw one of them was referencing how some new caves revealed some additional fragments. And in one of the fragments, there is one called In Praise of King Jonathan. And that stands in contrast to the standard model because King Jonathan should have been one of the wicked priests. Who is King Jonathan? And they're suggesting that King Jonathan would have been Alexander. I believe it was trying to find it's Alexander Jannaeus, known as Jonathan. So they're saying that because they found this fragment where it says in praise of King Jonathan and gives a little bit of praise, but it's a fragment. It's over as fast as it starts. But it's suggestive that the community wasn't necessarily anti every Hasmonean because King Jonathan would have been an Hasmonean. Well, I suppose they could make that argument if they want to, but they've taken this fragment and a King Jonathan referring to Alexander Jannaeus as though he's King Jonathan. And I don't think it can undo everything else. So I don't want to ignore the fact that they're offering And they seem to, I think these guys tend to agree. I don't think they like the standard model. They don't necessarily agree with it. They think there's something to this whole um, um, idea that the community wasn't so anti-Hasmonean as the standard model would suggest. Now, I will say, and I'm not going to spend any more time on it. You could read it if you want to. I want to acknowledge that they've said something, but I read it and I found the arguments so weak, especially when it stands against the actual history and the things that have happened, who the teacher of righteousness is, who the war scroll, just all of the information. Plus, they go on to continue to talk about the teacher of righteousness, and they still consider him the founder of the community. So there's just too many gaps. And they've got one final. I guess there's one final section called this Dead Sea Scrolls Today, and then they offer a timeline. I'm sorry. Then they offer a section called Reading the Dead Sea Scroll, etc. But then I think that's where they set off with the various documents. So that's the end of these three books, and you kind of get an idea of who they're telling us the identity of the community is. They're all asserting, and if you were to read without any other understanding and assuming that they know what they're talking about and that they have studied out the old writings and understand this correctly, you as a reader of these scrolls would be dismissive of what they are because they would appear to belong to a sectarian sect called the Essenes, or just there are so many explanations other than the one that I think has the most credibility and the most import, the most importance to us, and that is that this community is where the faithful remnant, when the Zadokite priests were deposed, it's where the faithful remnant went. And under the leadership of the Zadokite priests and the Levitical priests, retained a library of faithful documents and an effort to continue in Torah righteousness under the leadership of the teacher of righteousness, which is Messiah. And while they were in this 200 years of community, they wrote some, at least many actually things, but we have some coherent passages, the community rule and the Damascus document and the war scroll. And if you read it, I think you'll be impressed by what it says and how it just fits Scripture. I'm not anxious. I'm not going to go out on a limb and call it Scripture, but I'm also not going to, I am going to give heed to it. I am going to receive it as potential Scripture, and I'm going to listen to it. And to the extent it does not detract from what I've learned in the old writings and actually embraces and helps build it and affirms it, I'm going to receive it. And that's my point. That's my objective in all of this, is to say to you, do not listen to these guys. They will cause you to put things like this at arm's length, to not take it as serious as you should. And if you receive it in the same manner that I am telling you we should, then it's very important, because it certainly affirms other documents that we've held as Scripture, even if you don't hold up the Damascus document, the war scroll, the community rule, and some of the others as Scripture. It affirms other things that the Pharisees and the early church rejected as Scripture, Jubilees, First Enoch, etc. And there is where you find so much information that affirms the entire story. It affirms why you are founded in your belief in the Messiah. If you're a Christian, a follower of the Christ, a follower of the Messiah, you have good reason besides just all the experiences you have. You have historical, logical, foundational reasons why your faith is founded in the grandest, biggest explanation of what could be going on in this creation. That's my purpose. Thanks. From here, I'm going to move off of these passages, and I'm going to go on to the teacher of righteousness, and I'm going to focus on Dead Sea Scrolls translated going forward.